Okay, so welcome everybody to our webinar, What's in an Accent, which is all about accent discrimination in the labor market. We're really happy to have you here today. My name is Tamina Jaffrey, and I'm a senior equity, diversity, and inclusion consultant at Turner Consulting Group, which is a EDI consulting firm here in the Greater Toronto area. Before we get started, I'd like to do a land acknowledgement. We'd like to acknowledge that the land we are speaking to you from today is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, the Huron, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. We acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13, signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaty, signed with the multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands, and Brampton is covered by Treaty 19, which is the adjacent purchase signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit. And we honor living on, working on, and enjoying this land. And we welcome you to also mention, which communities and traditional territories that you are located on as well. So before we get started, we just want to give some housekeeping guidelines. Today's session will be recorded for information sharing purposes, and the session will be about 45 minutes of discussion, followed by 10 minutes for questions as well. So we're looking forward to having some engagement with the audience too. And you can feel free to share questions in the Q&A box or your comments in the chat. And you can also turn on captions for accessibility, which are located at the bottom of your Zoom window. We would just ask that everyone please keep their interactions respectful and have mics muted throughout the presentation as well. And we're also going to be distributing a handout with takeaways after the webinar, and we will also provide a link for this recording and the short video that we're going to be showing today, which is called What's in an Accent? I want to introduce our esteemed panelists today as well, who will be speaking with us on the topic of accent discrimination. So we have Tana Turner, who is the principal consultant and CEO of Turner Consulting Group. Tana Turner is a researcher, consultant, and advocate for social justice and systems change. She has been a former provincial public servant and has worked in the field of equity, diversity, and inclusion since 1987. She's also a leader in the field, having supported many organizations to implement the programs and practical steps needed to advance their equity journey. We also have joining us Ivana Heidag, who is an associate professor of organization studies at the Said Business School at University of Oxford. And Ivana is also an associate professor and Anne Brown chair in the organization studies at Schulich School of Business at York University. And her research focuses on workplace EDI with non-native English accents and intersections with language, gender, and race. And her work has been published in several publications such as Harvard Business Review, Globe and Mail, Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, and the New York Times. And she's the proud mom of two young, highly energetic and adventurous children. We also have joining us Vijay Ramjetan, who is a critical adult educator and researcher who works at University of Toronto and University of Guelph, and his teaching and research interests relate to the intersections of language, race, and workplace learning. And he's also a member of the Language, Culture, and Justice Hub at Brandeis University, and he's currently working on a book on accent as an object of work for international teaching assistants. And we do have some regrets from another one of our esteemed panelists, Olayinka Ekenkwo, who's a barrister and solicitor and notary public. Unfortunately, due to unforeseen circumstances, she wasn't able to join us. So we will be proceeding. And I'm actually now going to hand it over to Tana to show a video that Turner Consulting Group has been working on to very much show the impact of accent discrimination in the workplace. So I'm just going to stop sharing my slides.
Okay, thanks so much, Tamina. And before I show the video, I just wanted to take a few minutes to introduce it and certainly, to talk a bit about what inspired the short video. And Turner Consulting Group conducts a lot of equity audits. And to this date, I think we're on probably number 75. And when we conduct the equity audits, we hold focus groups with employees to hear about their experiences in the workplace. And when we talk to racialized employees in particular, certainly they share the impact of racial discrimination on their opportunities to be hired for advancement and inclusion in the workplace. But they also share experiences of accent discrimination that certainly intersects with racial discrimination and sometimes is a proxy for racial discrimination. And we hear of accent discrimination even in organizations where there's a good deal of diversity and a good deal of racial diversity. We hear about it in organizations in which the community served has a high proportion of immigrants. We hear about accent discrimination in organizations that serve immigrants, right? So very surprising sometimes where we hear about accent discrimination. And it comes up a lot in school boards. So even when there's a large proportion of students who are newcomers, certainly we hear concerns about putting teachers with accents in these classes. And certainly Canada has recently announced that immigration levels will remain high over the coming years. And I believe the last announcement was that immigration will hit 500,000 people each year. And we know that the vast majority of these newcomers will be racialized. And even as Canada admits the best and the brightest from around the world, and we continue to rely on immigration for labor market and population growth, we put up so many barriers to their success once they're here. And certainly too, the barriers are higher for racialized immigrants, and that includes accent discrimination. So this really got me thinking about accents, accent discrimination, and how organizations that have EDI programs really need to pay closer attention to accent discrimination and how it further impacts racialized employees and how it can be used as a proxy for racial discrimination. So this short film was just a way to get us thinking about accents and the assumptions that we make about people based on their accent, and certainly hope that it gets you thinking as well. So with that, I'll just play the video for you.
We all speak with an accent.
My accent may be different than yours.
Depending on where I grew up or have lived, I could sound like this. Or I could sound like this.
Or I could sound like this.
An accent is a difference in pronunciation.
My accent is not a sign of intelligence.
In fact, studies show that people who speak more than one language have more gray matter in their brains, which is a sign of greater intelligence. An accent does not mean I'm an English language learner.
In fact, I may come from a country in which people speak hundreds of languages, and English is one of our official languages.
Or from a country where we speak English, but pronunciation is different than in your country.
Just because I look and sound like this doesn't mean I'm any more qualified or competent
than someone who looks and sounds like this.
My value is not tied to my accent, and as long as I'm able to communicate effectively, it shouldn't matter what I sound like.
Instead of focusing on my accent and the way I look,
assess me based on my skills, competence, and knowledge.
Focusing on what I'm saying instead of how I'm saying it will help ensure that you don't miss brilliance that I bring to the job.
Thank you so much for that excellent video, Tana. Obviously, that was something that we were working on at Turner Consulting Group. And as you can see, we tried to make sure that we highlighted a great diversity of different accents too. So we hope you enjoyed that. And thank you so much to Olayinka as well for joining us. I'm actually just going to quickly share my screen so that I can do an intro for her as well. And let me just put this up right here. So Olayinka Ikenkwo is a barrister, solicitor, and notary public, and she has a law office of Olayinka Ikenkwo, which is based in Ajax, Ontario. And her work experience has been extensively in the Ontario Public Service with various legal departments within the Ministry of Labour, the Ministry of the Attorney General, and the Workplace Discrimination and Harassment Prevention Office at the Ministry of Government and Consumer Services. She's also passionate about inspiring others and is the author of 3 books, including the Amazon bestseller, Scaling the Bar. And she also enjoys traveling, hiking, and the outdoors. So without further ado, I'm going to provide the platform over to Olayinka to talk to us about accent discrimination. Thank you, Olayinka.
Hello, everyone. Good day, good afternoon. I just want to say a quick thank you to the Turner Consulting Group, Turner and Thamina for inviting me as a panelist. And also, I just want to quickly acknowledge the fellow panelists, Ivona and Vijay. Good. Just as Thamina has introduced me, I'm a lawyer here, but my journey has been quite interesting. So I have a lived experience of, well, I'd say, quote unquote, accent discrimination. So my original country is Nigeria, but in Nigeria there are several hundreds of languages, and I happen to live in various parts of Nigeria, which while growing up, so that affected my accent. Even with my mother tongue, when I speak, it's kind of a little bit different because of my background. But and then Nigeria was colonized by the British. So as a child, our schooling was all the way from kindergarten to university was all in English. English is the only language that is even spoken in my home, mainly while growing up. And in the course of the university, I had to go to Russia and had to learn Russian language, speak Russian language. And post-university, I find myself in the UK, and I'm working in the northern part of UK, which has the totally different accent from the normal British accent. And while working there, I also worked with government institutions. I really never had any issues with my accent in terms of people complaining about my accent until I arrived Canada. And so Canada is totally kind of a different experience for me. I want to talk a little bit about before coming to Canada as a permanent resident, you have to do this IELTS test. And the test involved writing, reading, comprehension, and spelling, all the works. And excuse me, you had to have a certain score to qualify to come in as a permanent resident, which I did. So coming to Canada, I began, it was right, even in the workplace that I found out that, oh, this is not going to be very interesting, because people then start asking you, oh, your accent is interesting, where are you from, and all of that. And eventually I find out that accent is like a really major issue, because then I'm in meetings and I say certain things, and everybody and some people feel like they couldn't understand me, they're confused, and then a Canadian with Canadian accent, so to speak, say the same thing I've said, and everybody understands. And that went on in the workplace for a while. Now, considering the fact that at a particular point in time, my portfolio included me talking to a wide range of Ontarians, across people across Ontario, and I will find that sometimes I'm speaking with some clients of mine, and they totally understand me. And some people will like go right to my supervisor and say they never understood a word of anything I said, or that, you know, they should take me off, or I don't understand English, or I can't speak English. And it became very confusing for me. Even at this point, I had written a book. I was an author, and I'm like, I can write, of course I can speak, and I've gone to law school, and I went to law school in the UK. And in the UK, you don't even have you don't take books into the exam. You have to know your matter. You know, I'm intelligent. I know what it. But so that was my experience in the workplace. It wasn't very interesting. But I found out that when I now started my own practice as a lawyer, and I have a diverse range of clients coming from different communities, and I understand them, and they understand me. And some of them don't even speak English clearly, but I understand them because they come, they speak to me, they tell me their issue. I understand them, and they understand me. I've never really had, since I started my own practice, like those issues like I had in the workplace. And in the workplace, it was almost turning as if I was just totally stupid, and I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't know anything. And even no matter how much I tried, I couldn't give my best. And it was very distressing for me. And I'm really thankful for the opportunity to have my own practice and get to see how my accent is playing out, you know, right now, even in the workplace. And going forward, I recently I was watching a webinar, and it told that there was a study that was done, I think from the York University, the Department of Psychology, and they went and did a study on accents, and they found out that people, you know, people will perceive people with accents as less credible or less trustworthy. And that's very concerning for me, that because of my accent, you consider me less credible, or because of my accent, you consider me less trustworthy. And this is like Tana mentioned earlier, Canada will continue to focus on immigration. As we speak, the immigrants are trooping into Canada. And if we do not deal with this issue now, because it seems like everybody's like, just like racism and everything, people are trying to look the other way and saying, oh, nothing is happening. But especially in the workplace, like the video mentioned, your value is not, your accent should not be based on your value. You have value. Everybody has value. Everybody has something to share. Not especially if you're an immigrant that has gone through all those hoops to come into Canada. You should be given a fair chance despite your accent. So and again, the Department of Psychology in York University, they gave some recommendations. One of them is we should be focusing on our similarities rather than my accent, my tongue. And I'm sure, and that's why I really applaud the work that Turner Consulting Group they're working on, and other panelists as well. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you, Thamina. Thank you, Turner.
Thank you so much, Olenka. Obviously, you've had such an incredible journey, and is something to be extremely proud about. And I know that people in the comments are saying that they can relate to your story. And I think a lot of people and a lot of immigrants can also relate to some of the things you talked about in the workplace, and the really, racist type of comments that are made towards people with non-native accents. So thank you so much for sharing your personal story with us. I'm now going to turn it over to our next panelist, Ivana Heidag, and I will just bring your slides up as well so that we can get those going. And I think you can see them now, and I will help navigate the slides. So off to Ivana. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tamina. Good day, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you may be. Welcome to our session. I'm very pleased to see we have a very global audience today because this is indeed a global issue, not necessarily pertaining only to Canada. And I'm very thankful to Tana and Tamina for organizing this important session, and very much honored to be here today sharing my work with you alongside with my fantastic panelists, Olyanka and Vijay. So very pleased to be here and happy to answer any questions after. So what I would like to do today, I would like to share some of my work and work more broadly on accents in the workplace. As I'm a scholar, as Tamina mentioned, as a researcher, I'm studying equity, diversity, and inclusion in the workplace. And one of the topics I've been studying and focusing on is indeed accent work and accent discrimination at the workplace. And as you can probably also hear, I also have lived experiences as speaking as a non-native speaker. I've been speaking and living in Canada for over 20 years, and yet this is still my accent. And yet I still do get questions, where are you from? So I can totally relate to all of these things. So what in particular I would like to talk today a little bit about is going to be about women with non-native accents and experiences, in particular racialized women. Thank you, Tamina. So before I kind of indulge a little bit more into the work that I've been conducting, I just want to provide a few definitions about what I mean here by non-native English accents. So a non-native English accent refers to speakers who have learned English later in their life, such that they maintain the phonology of their native language. This is the sounds of the speech while they speak English. Indeed, a large body of research in linguistics shows that it is really difficult to acquire a native-like pronunciation if you learn another language beyond early childhood. Beyond the age of 10, it starts to become really difficult, and extremely difficult beyond the age of 16. Not impossible, but for most of us, we will still maintain the phonology and sound speeches of our native languages. So, you know, if you don't learn it early in life, this has nothing to do with our competence. It's just the way the speech and our acquisition of speech works. And this is also different from speaking with British or Australian accent or any other regional accents, which still are the native languages. And there is a lot of research on that as well. But what I've been focusing my work is no native, meaning, you know, as I said, somebody who learned English as a second language later in life. And speaking with non-native English accent is a separate phenomenon from competency or fluency in the English language. Often the two are confused, thinking the moment you hear an accent, the person is not fluent. But non-native accent does not mean that there is no fluency. Indeed, a person can be quite competent in English and acquire all the aspects of grammar and yet keep the accent. And the accent is also an important marker of identity. That's another piece of research that we relate to our accents, and taking it away is also kind of taking away parts of our identities as well. Yeah. Next slide, please, Tamina. Thank you. So what past research has mostly shown, and actually Olyanka touched a little bit upon that on the research that she's learned about from the psychology department. There's a lot of work in psychology and linguistics, but the work that I've been doing and the work that I indulge in, it's the work relating to the workplace. So most research relating to the workplace shows pretty much straightforward negative evaluations and ratings of workers with non-native accents, such as mentioned, you know, lower competence, lower hiring recommendations, lower credibility, lower trust, just because we speak with accents, all else equal. However, most of these past research is focused on men as speakers and workers, and thus omitting women's unique experiences. In other words, and this is not just the case with this work, but a lot of sciences have focused predominantly on men and their experiences, omitting women as a population, a separate population that may have different experiences with accents. And this is where my colleagues' work actually has started. And what really is important here, and kind of relates to some points that Tana made at the beginning, is that more than half of our immigrants actually are women, with 84% of those women being racialized women. So we do have a huge immigrant population that we don't know much about their experiences in terms of accents, at least from a research viewpoint. Next slide, please, Tamina. Thank you. So, and here is some work. I just want to share some highlight findings that I found with my colleagues, Sam Hancock and Winnie Shen. So we've been doing this work for quite a few years at this point. And here, this is just one paper. And in this work, we focused in particular non-native accents and experiences of Asian women, in particular East Asian women. And what we've been finding in this work is that Asian women with non-native accents face a subtle and difficult to detect bias manifested in a form of amplified warmth evaluations. And by warmth, we refer to traits such as friendliness, trustfulness, and sincere. So unlike most other research where the straightforward implications being that people with accents is seen as less trustworthy, as less competent, what we're finding is actually that Asian women, particularly with accents, actually seen as warmer than Asian women with no accents. And women are traditionally stereotyped as warm, yet stereotyping women as warm, although on surface this seems nice and positive, is rooted in problematic sexist attitudes because it's putting or kind of pigeonholing women in traditional communal roles that they are expected to be in. And as such, what we're finding with this work is that these seemingly positive valuations of warmth are pushing Asian women with no-native accents into traditional feminine jobs. And these are the jobs where we see the majority of women occupying and tend to be jobs of lower pay and lower prestige. At the same time, these women are not getting encouragement and pushed to go into the jobs where there is a severe underrepresentation of women, including racialized women, and those would be more men-dominated occupations of jobs that tend to be of more higher prestige, higher status, and also higher pay as well. So on the surface, it seems like it's a positive thing, but they are being pushed into particular types of positions that fit with traditional gender roles. And this is contributing to occupational gender segregation that we are seeing in the workplace as well. Okay, next slide, please, Tamina. Thank you. So and I want to share a few things what potentially policymakers, organizations, and managers can do to address the accent bias and the warmth bias. So the first one is indeed to recognize the biases that women, and in particular, in this case, racialized and Asian women with access experiences are subtle and difficult to recognize. And they are not necessarily the same the way that the men gonna experience this bias, and they're more likely to be overlooked and not recognized. At the policy level, in particular government policy level in Canada, in particular, we need a more explicit recognition that non-native accents are a discriminatory factor impacting immigrants' job prospects and well-being. Right now, this is not explicit in Human Rights Charter. There is prohibition on discrimination based on the your place of origin or ethnicity, but not based on accent and language. And also we need to recognize there is this intersectionality of this bias that men and women are not necessarily valued the same. That it doesn't mean that women fare off any better. It's just a different kind of bias. And indeed, I would say more precarious bias because it's so hard to detect that bias. And I see in the comments, benevolent sexism, that is indeed the ideology that we do that theoretically that these women are being patronized and treated in very benevolent sexist manner. So the other thing that we're suggesting that at corporate level, when you think about equity diverse initiatives, and there are many these days, they all address race, they address gender, not necessarily together at the same time. But there is a big gap in addressing accent discrimination, which is also related to racism as well, could be sexism. But this is a huge gap that organizations could take on in promoting greater equity and social justice by addressing this particular bias as well. And organizations should be seeking to hire, in particular, more racialized women with accents in high visibility, in high status positions to signal these possibilities, to signal that that we do value these women. These women are competent and they can occupy positions of high status and high pay. And more broadly, what our work kind of implicating and suggesting is that the stereotypical warmth evaluations, once surface positive, we really need to be mindful that they're undermining gender equity. And in this case, we showed in particular undermining racialized women with accents in the workplace. Okay, thank you. Next slide, Tamina. I think that's the last slide. Yeah, so just want to conclude at this, and here is my email if anybody would like to email me about anything. So I want to thank you all for listening, and I think we'll have a Q&A session for the last 10 minutes of the session. Thank you so much, Tamina.
Thank you so much, Ivana. We really appreciate, especially your extensive research on the cross-section of Asian women and looking at warmth bias. That was definitely really interesting. So I'm going to now hand it over to our last panelist, Vijay, and I'm just gonna open up his slides as well. And you can take it away, Vijay.
So yeah, thank you so much, Tamina and Tana as well, for organizing this event and allowing us to have this conversation. I really appreciate it. And of course, thank you to Olayinka and Ivana for your wonderful remarks. They're actually a good background with regard to what I want to say today. So I'm going to keep my remarks fairly brief. But I want to title my remarks Racializing and Rethinking Intelligibility. Next slide, please. So I want to just briefly talk about these intersections of accent, work, and intelligibility. So when we think about modern work today, oral communication is really a main feature of how we do work, right? So in order to accomplish some sort of work task, we need to communicate with each other orally, verbally. But the implication of this is that oftentimes all aspects of our speech can be under scrutiny by our employers, right? So for example, our vocal accents, right, can be treated as this sort of bona fide occupational requirement. So in particular, accent is often tied to this notion of intelligibility, right? This ability to be understood. And from a sort of logical perspective, right, it kind of makes sense, right? So if you have to speak for your job and people can't understand your speech, right, that's going to affect the work that you can do, right? You're going to be perceived as a failed worker of some sort. But when we dig deeper, right, this perspective is flawed on many levels. But one particular flaw that I want to focus on today is how it doesn't really consider how the notion of intelligibility is often kind of determined through various non-linguistic factors. Next slide, please. So in order to argue this, I want to just briefly talk about a fairly famous study that was conducted by Donald Rubin all the way back in 1992. So if I have any applied linguists, language educators in the audience, you probably know this study already, but if not, I'll just offer you a brief summary right now. So basically, Rubin did this experiment where he had two groups of undergraduate students in the US listen to a recorded lecture given by a so-called native speaker of American English. So both groups of students heard the same lecture by the same speaker, but the only difference between the two was that the first group of students were made to believe that they were listening to a white woman give the lecture. Conversely, the second group of students were made to believe that an East Asian woman was giving the lecture. Okay, so once again, both groups heard the same lecture from the same speaker, but they just thought that they were listening to different speakers. So when Rubin did a comprehension test of the lecture with both groups of students, what was perplexing and surprising was how the first group of students scored way higher on the tests than the second group of students. And furthermore, the second group of students thought that they heard a so-called foreign accent coming from the Asian woman, which was strange because the Asian woman was speaking with a so-called native speaker accent. Next slide, please. So, you know, this finding from Rubin's experiment actually raises 3 points that I want to emphasize in my remarks today. Excuse me. So first of all, when we think about this idea of hearing accents, we're often hearing race. Secondly, when we think about this notion of intelligibility or a lack of intelligibility, this is not just about the speaker, it's also something that's co-created by the listener. And finally, when we talk about improving intelligibility, right, I think we can't really achieve this goal without addressing listening practices. So what I'm going to do for the rest of my time is just sort of briefly explain each of these points. So next slide, please. So first of all, I want to emphasize that race and racism are auditory. So yes, many of us know that race is a social construct. It's not biologically real. It's a social creation. But we also want to recognize how race is also a multi-sensory construct, right? So race is not just something we see. We recreate race through our hearing, our taste, our smell, touch. All of our bodily senses recreate race in different ways. But the issue is that we often perceive of race and racism in visual terms, right? So race, once again, is something we see. Racism is a visual type of oppression. But the problem with this perspective is that it becomes easy to ignore how they can be also reproduced through our ears, right? Through our listening practices. So in particular, right, if we don't acknowledge that race and racism are auditory, this allows us to justify a lot of workplace racism on different levels. So if we think of race and racism as visual, right, we don't really see how accent discrimination, for example, can be a proxy for racial discrimination, as Tana mentioned in her remarks. Next slide, please. Another thing I want to emphasize is that intelligibility is a listener creation. So when we think about intelligibility, it's not a neutral static construct. It's very much contextual. It really depends on the listener. So if I have a lot of exposure to so-called foreign accented speech, if I'm monolingual or bilingual, all of these sorts of things can influence how intelligible I find a so-called foreign accented speaker, right? So once again, listener background plays a big role in what they find intelligible versus unintelligible. Once again, listening is not this neutral static thing. It's very much ideological. It's ideologically filtered. And with that said, we should understand intelligibility as a racialized construct. And there is a lot of research, there's a lot of terminology that's used to discuss this very point. So for example, Kang and Rubin talk about reverse linguistic stereotyping, whereby listeners use the social identity of a speaker to sort of judge what they're hearing from the speaker, right? Even though the speaker may be speaking in a completely different manner that they're perceiving. Flores and Rosa talk about the white listening subject. So this is an ideological mode of perception whereby listeners just perceive the language practices of racialized people as perpetually deviant, even if they're engaging in the same spoken language practices as privileged white people. So once again, there's, you can have an ideal sounding accent, but your listener may be perceiving you in a way that you can't control. Next slide, please. So I want to just briefly talk about this notion of intelligibility and so-called accent reduction programs for immigrant job seekers. Okay, so if once again intelligibility is tied to this notion, is tied to listening, we really want to question the efficacy of so-called accent reduction programs for immigrant job seekers. So here I'm not talking about whether it's actually possible to change an accent. That's another conversation in itself. I'm really talking about the efficacy in terms of the social world of accents, right? So at least for me, the problem with these programs is that they often focus on the deficiencies of racially minoritized immigrants while ignoring individual and institutional listening practices, right? So if we go back to Rubin's study, right, somebody can have a so-called reduced accent and still be perceived as incomprehensible because their listener is not, is swayed by various ideologies of oppression. So that's something just to consider. Also, this whole idea of changing immigrant accents distracts from institutional racism, right? So when we talk about immigrant unemployment, oftentimes it has to do with a lack of credentials, a lack of so-called Canadian work experience. So how does actually changing an accent solve all of these structural barriers, right? It doesn't. Next slide, please. So very quickly, I want us to rethink intelligibility, right? So in order to do this, I think we need to enact a series of counter-pedagogies to rethink this construct. So first of all, as many of my colleagues have already mentioned, we want to really recognize accent and language in general as being connected to anti-oppression, So language is related to race, it's related to gender, it's related to class, disability, and so on. Also, I want us to develop training for both speakers and listeners in the same space, right? So communication is a two-way street. So why are we focusing only on the speaker and ignoring the listener? And then finally, instead of fixing immigrant accents, so going back to Ivana's point, we really need to sort of challenge institutionalized racism. So challenging our government officials to change laws, protesting, organizing, all of those sorts of good stuff to make lasting change. Next slide, please. Yeah, so these are just the references that I've used in my slides. And final slide. Yeah, so thank you so much for listening to me. And yeah, here's my contact information. And yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vijay. Those were really excellent points, especially when we're looking at this type of interpretation that the listener is applying to the accent. And as you mentioned, being a proxy for really what is racism. So thank you to all of our panelists. We really appreciated each and every one of your presentations and the learnings that you shared with us. So now we're going to actually go into our Q&A session. I do believe that there's a couple of questions that I will just read out now. So Masika is asking, is ESL, or English as a Second Language, still a socially acceptable term or acronym to refer to non-native English speakers? So I'm not sure, is there anyone in particular who wants to take that one? And yeah, we'd love for you to all come on camera.
I guess I can take that because I am in the field of English language teaching, and this is kind of a big issue. So I don't have a good answer, but in a technical sense, ESL doesn't really make sense because oftentimes for multilingual individuals, right, English might be their third, fourth, fifth, etc. language. So in that technical sense, it doesn't really make sense. Also, when we think about colonial English and colonialism, right? The way that English was learned was kind of simultaneous to any home languages that were learned at the same time. So once again, it's kind of a messy, we can't really categorize language. It's too messy. So terms like ESL, this is a big conversation in the ESL field. So once again, I think it's something that we have to interrogate more, but there's not a good, substitute for me. But I don't know if anyone else has any comments on that?
Yeah.
Sorry,
just to add, because I see in school boards, they're using ELL, right? English language learners. But the problem for me is that they apply that label to any student with an accent, right? Even though they may have been speaking English, again, one of the many languages they know. And just to add to that a bit, one of the things I've seen is that students then who come to the school now are registering and they have an accent or their parent has an accent, they are immediately put in classes for English language learners without being tested, without any sort of assessment. And just because they have an accent, they're perceived to be English language learners. But that's the term I'm seeing used now in the school setting.
Olenka, did you?
Yes, I just can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to share my experience when I went to law school in the UK. My first lecture in contract law was the lecturer was from Ireland. She had a very strong Irish accent, and I was in the class, and for the first few minutes, my brain was like, I thought I could never understand this teacher, but I had to train myself because definitely she was a professor and I'm the student. She knows her audience. I can't write her off and say, oh, she doesn't know what she's saying just because I didn't understand what she was saying. I had to train myself and I had to pass her class. So I had to train myself, sit in front, do everything I needed to do as a listener to understand her.
Great. No, thank you so much, Alinka, and really appreciate that real life example of you as the listener also having a part in this as well. So there's another question here. Somebody's actually asking, Larissa is asking that as a diversity, equity, and inclusion and belonging consultant, how can I approach small and mid-sized businesses and invite them to address these biases? Is there any advice on the communication to attract their attention? I don't know if anyone wants to try it.
I can start and see if anybody wants to add, but certainly I'm thinking this is really connected to the biases, unconscious and sometimes conscious biases that employers, hiring managers have about particular groups of people. So certainly, thinking about the training and understanding that they need, because it's not just about hiring, it's about how are we including and fostering welcoming environments so that those people will stay and thrive within those organizations. I see sometimes the organizations focus on hiring and then they have a revolving door because staff aren't supporting their inclusion. So certainly, connecting it to the training and understanding they need, and also connecting it to the reality. The labor market is tight, and certainly what they're going to need to do is rather than only hiring from an increasingly smaller pool of people, they need to broaden that net if organizations are to be successful. I hope that helps.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Tana. We have, I don't know if anyone else wants to jump in, but we have another question that is about this is from Nicole, what are some strategies that can be utilized from HR teams to address managers who will identify language barriers as a justification for not hiring non-native English speakers? I can read it out again. Thanks.
Yeah, just a brief kind of comment or something maybe more practical. I do find like for managers, like just the whole interviewing process, like I think it's helpful to have panel interviews, right? So if one interviewer sort of perceives a non-native accented applicant as sort of problematic, at least there are people to sort of counterweigh their perceptions. I think from a practical level, I think we need sort of more people in the interview process just to kind of check each other. Yeah, that was, I wanted to add that, yeah.
Yeah, and just to add, I find having a formal structured hiring process helps, where people are actually evaluated on what they say, not how they say it, and making sure you're connecting the assessment of candidates to the actual skills and abilities needed for the job. And that helps the panelists actually listen past the accent to what the person's actually saying as well.
Great, thank you. Ivana, yeah.
Yeah, I just want to, it's excellent points here. I also want to add that, what could be helpful would be a training and educational managers, what accents mean. A lot of times there's this perception that you haven't tried hard enough to acquire native-like pronunciation. Like there is something deficit about you because you're not maybe intelligent enough, competent enough, because otherwise by now, you've been living here for 20 years. How come you don't speak like a native speaker? So just educating, especially from, and Vijay's expert in this linguistics piece shows very clearly that this is extremely difficult beyond early childhood. Just educating, this is the fact. And it doesn't come easily, could go a long way. And the other thing is also educating them that exposure to accents, and this is some work that Vijay presented, increases our access to this language, increases our understanding. So the more accents we expose to, we are more comfortable, it comes easier to us. And we need that to make our workplace more inclusive. So we want people in high status positions in power with different accents, because this signals true inclusivity. or that organization is offering, because otherwise we only steer people with accents in certain positions. We'll steer them in a position that does, and this is what happens a lot of time. We hire them for positions that don't require speaking because we don't want them speaking. No, we want them in speaking positions because this is the reality that we live in a very diverse world and have a very diverse workforce, and we all need to get used to various accents.
That's excellent. Thank you so much, Ivana. Yeah, Olinka?
I totally agree with Ivana, because in my mind, I'm thinking, okay, it's okay if you interview them, bring them into the workplace, but also train the supervisors and everything. So it's one thing to train, and it's one thing for people to really get the training, because we're still talking about discrimination even right now with all the training, all the policies and everything. But like Ivana said, I would like to see people with accents in the government, and people with accents, I mean, so to say, you know what I mean, that with different accent in high places, as ministers, as deputy ministers, as, you know, in high places, so then we know that it's a level playing field, rather than having people with just Canadian accent on those top, and then they just bring people at the bottom, and we, you know, nobody's really dealing with the real issues at that point.
Thank you so much, Olinka and Ivana, for describing that stratification of accents and making sure that they're more visible at the top. So just being mindful of time, I know there's a lot of amazing questions. We might just do one more, and I'm just going in order of how they're coming. Bashir has asked, is there any possible way that we can steer the different levels of government towards advocacy, especially when this is already costing our economy too much? A lot of great immigrants are tagged as misfits, even though they have admirable credentials and know their stuff quite well. So this is, yeah, focusing more on advocacy.
Yeah, and I think the way to influence your government is to write letters, let them know what's important to you. And certainly it is costing our economy billions of dollars. So certainly I would suggest that that you write your member of provincial parliament and federal parliament as well.
Great. Thank you so much, Tana. Any other thoughts on that particular question, Vijay?
Yeah, I know we sort of criticize social media a lot, but like I feel like there is power in a public pedagogy. So just even, you know, tagging your local politician, you know, provincial, federal leaders, just to sort of shame them, you know, just have them just, you know, being vocal about, you know, what you want to see changed. I think there is potential in social media, but, you know, there are a lot of problems with it at the same time, but that's another maybe avenue to sort of show some, express your support.
Absolutely, that's a great strategy for sure. So just being mindful of the time and, you know, really appreciative of all the excellent comments and questions that we've been getting in the chat and Q&A. I want to take the opportunity to thank all of our panelists. We really appreciated all of the information that you shared with us. And I actually want to drop in the chat as well our Turner Consulting Group website. We have a lot of different reports, blog articles, resources that you may want to check out. It can be very beneficial for you, especially if you're working in the EDI field as well. And in addition to that, we will be sending out a handout with some takeaways of the learnings from today. And we'll be making available this recording as well as the link to the video that we shared today. But we want to thank everybody, both the panelists and all of you for attending. We really hope that you've benefited from this, and we look forward to continuing these types of conversations with you. Thank you so much for coming.
Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you for having us. Thank you.
Thank you.